Imagine this: winter 1259. Deep in the Polish wilderness, peasants stumble upon a chilling sight. Not just frozen corpses, but frozen horsemen, sitting upright in their saddles, their faces locked in a silent scream against the biting wind. These were Mongol scouts, the vanguard of the dreaded Golden Horde. But instead of terror, the Poles felt something new: contempt. They dragged these frozen statues to the market square, propped them up, and turned them into a mockery. A public declaration that the age of fear was over. This wasn't just a discovery. It was the first shot in Poland's darkest revenge. For decades, Europe had lived in the shadow of the Mongol terror. At the Battle of Legnica in 1241, they weren't just defeated, they were butchered. Mongol warriors filled 9 massive sacks with the right ears of their European victims. They leveled cities like Krakow and Sandomierz, turning them into ghost towns. They drank from the skulls of children and left entire populations to starve. The trauma ran deep, a festering wound in the European psyche. But by 1259, that fear had curdled into a cold, hard fury. The Poles remembered the horror, and they were ready to pay it back tenfold. The architect of this vengeance was Duke Bolesław the Chaste. He wasn't a military genius in the traditional sense, but he understood the Mongols better than any king or knight. He knew their strength wasn't their bows or their savagery, it was their horses. The Mongol army was a living, breathing cavalry machine. Take away the horse, and you take away the Mongol. So Bolesław devised a brutal, scorched earth strategy. He ordered his people to burn everything. Every field of grain, every patch of grassland turned to ash. Wells were poisoned, fields were salted so nothing could grow for years. But his most devious tactic was biological warfare. They began planting gift horses, animals deliberately infected with glanders, a highly contagious and fatal equine disease, along the Mongol invasion routes. Poland was preparing to become a dead land. When the legendary Mongol general Nogai Khan rode into Poland with 30,000 elite horsemen, he expected to find plunder and terrorized peasants. Instead, he found an apocalyptic wasteland. The villages were empty, smoldering ruins. The wells were filled with poison and animal carcasses. There was no food, no fodder, nothing. They even found that the Poles had dug up their own graves and carted away the bones, denying the Mongols the calcium they needed to make arrowheads. Then, the real horror began. Nogai's prized war horses started coughing, then bleeding from the nose. Glanders ripped through the Mongol herds like wildfire. The horses, the very soul of the horde, were dying in droves. Stranded in this frozen hellscape, the Mongols soon realized they weren't alone. A new kind of war began, a ghost war. The attackers weren't knights in shining armor. They were Polish peasants, forest hunters who knew the land like the back of their hands. They moved like phantoms in the night. Their methods were terrifyingly simple. Slip into the Mongol camp, slit the throats of the horses, and vanish back into the darkness. The Mongols would wake up to find their mounts dead, their mobility gone, their fate sealed in the snow. Each dead horse was a psychological blow, a silent message from the ghosts in the woods. We are everywhere. We can kill you whenever we want. As the Mongol army weakened, the Poles tightened the noose. They left poisoned food traps, sacks of grain, barrels of mead, and salted meats laced with hemlock and wolfsbane. The starving Mongols fell for it every time. Racked by disease, hunger, and now poison-induced hallucinations, their discipline shattered. Mongol reports from this time are filled with terror, describing Poland not as a country, but as a land ruled by ghosts, where the trees themselves seemed to hunt them. They were no longer conquerors. They were prey. The final act of this gruesome play took place near the ruins of Sandomierz. Nogai Khan, desperate for a decisive victory, believed he had finally cornered Duke Bolesław and his forces. He charged, leading his remaining horsemen across a vast snow-covered field. But it was a trap. This wasn't a battlefield, it was an engineered killing field. Underneath the pristine snow lay a network of hidden trenches, sharpened stakes, and deep spike pits. The Mongol charge collapsed into chaos. Horses screamed as their legs were impaled, throwing their riders to the ground. In an instant, the fearsome Mongol cavalry was crippled, dismounted, and trapped. From the surrounding forests, Polish crossbowmen emerged. Their first targets weren't the men, they were the remaining horses. With the Mongol army trapped and horseless, the final, most brutal phase of the revenge began. It wasn't the knights who delivered the killing blow, it was the peasants. Thousands of them swarmed the field, armed not with swords, but with the tools of their trade. Scythes, flails, pitchforks, and hammers. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a harvest. They moved through the panicked Mongol ranks with cold, systematic efficiency, like threshing wheat, as one account described it. A bounty system was put in place, rewards for every pair of ears, every thumb, every head brought to the Duke's camp. The ear harvest of 1241 was repaid in blood, and the snow-covered field of Sandomierz turned red. And what of Nogai Khan? He was captured alive, a prize for Duke Bolesław. But there would be no ransom, no honorable execution. Bolesław wanted to send a message to the rest of the world. Nogai was stripped naked, his body painted with pig's blood, the ultimate insult to a Mongol warrior. He was paraded from village to village, each community taking its own pound of flesh. Finally, he was castrated and released, a broken man sent stumbling back east. The message was clear and barbaric. This is what Europe does to invaders. We will not just defeat you, we will erase you. The ripple effect was immediate. The myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered. In 1260, King Ottokar II of Bohemia, inspired by the Polish tactics, met the Mongols at the Battle of Kressenbrunn. He didn't rely on cavalry charges. He used infantry formed into hollow squares, their pikes creating a forest of steel that impaled the Mongol horses. Behind the pikes, crossbowmen and knights in heavy plate armor weathered the arrow storms and cut down the invaders. The Mongol tactics, once unstoppable, were now useless. The Carpathian Mountains in winter became their prison. As the passes iced over and the snow piled high, their retreat ground to a halt. The vast, silent wilderness that was supposed to be their escape route transformed into a tomb of white. Hunger, a force more relentless than any army, became their new god. In the desperate, freezing silence, the unthinkable happened. Journals, later discovered, whisper of the ultimate taboo. To survive, the warriors of the Horde turned on each other. The conquerors of nations were reduced to consuming their own fallen comrades, a grim testament to their hopeless situation. When the spring thaw finally arrived, it wasn't a relief column that found them. Mountain villages, hardened by the landscape and their own recent suffering, descended upon the weakened survivors. But they didn't come to save them. They came to harvest. What followed was a chilling act of complete dehumanization. The Mongols' hair was collected and bound into brushes. Their tendons, once used to draw powerful composite bows, were stripped to become bowstrings for the villagers' own weapons. Their skulls, emptied of the minds that had planned the subjugation of Europe, were turned into macabre drinking bowls and utensils. The mountains, which had witnessed their desperation, now bore witness to their desecration, keeping a stony silence. The few who survived the cannibalism and the villagers' harvest faced a different but equally grim fate. They were rounded up, not as prisoners of war, but as commodities. Peasants sold them to Venetian traders, who had a well-established network for human trafficking. The once feared Mongol men were shipped east, ironically sold as slaves to the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, another warrior caste. The boys were subjected to the cruelest cut, becoming eunuchs for the courts of distant lords. The girls and women simply vanished into the brothels of the Mediterranean, their identities erased, given the mocking tragic name, Daughters of the Conquerors. Venetian shipping records from the era describe this human cargo with cold, commercial detachment. Unbroken, violent, forever staring west. A haunting image of defiance in the face of absolute defeat. Back in Poland, the victory needed a monument, but Duke Bolesław the Pious didn't want a monument of stone and bronze. He wanted one of vengeance. He commanded the construction of a church, a house of God built from the bones of the invaders. The mortar was mixed with the dust of their cremated remains. The walls were studded with their femurs and ribs. The altar itself was lined with their skulls, their empty eye sockets gazing out at the Polish faithful. For a time, it stood as a terrifying symbol, the Church of Divine Vengeance, a testament not just to victory, but to a wrath that mirrored the Horde's own cruelty. Years later, the Central Church authorities, horrified by this pagan display within a Christian sanctuary, condemned it as unholy and ordered it torn down. But the legend persisted. Villagers claimed for centuries that the soil where it once stood still bled white, saturated with the bone dust of the fallen invaders. The physical and spiritual annihilation of the horde wasn't enough. The idea of the Mongol had to be erased from the European psyche, not as a conqueror, but as a human being. From 1261 to 1263, a new kind of hunt began. Across Central and Eastern Europe, word spread like wildfire. Bounties were offered for Mongol scalps. Knights, mercenaries, lords, and even commoners who had once fled in terror now formed hunting parties. They pursued the scattered remnants of the horde through forests and swamps, not as soldiers, but as beasts to be exterminated. Captured scouts weren't interrogated. They were used to send a message. They were burned alive as living torches to light the roads at night, or their bodies were impaled on stakes, becoming grotesque border markers warning any others who might follow. The final Mongol raid planned for Poland collapsed before it even began. Its vanguard met not by a Polish army, but by a landscape of its own horrors. In a final, brutal irony, the Polish peasants turned the Mongols' own legendary tactics against them. The masters of the lightning raid and the feigned retreat now found themselves on the receiving end. Small groups of peasants would ambush Mongol patrols and then vanish back into the forests they knew so well. They poisoned wells and food caches left behind. They used their network of church bells, once a signal of warning and terror, as a signal to coordinate strikes. The bells would ring, and from the forests and fields, the people would emerge to attack. The once feared warriors of the apocalypse, now starving, disoriented and broken, fled in panic. They were mocked by villagers, with children throwing stones at the retreating figures who had once made kings tremble. The aftermath was a stark and brutal accounting. Of the estimated 30,000 elite warriors who had entered Poland under Nogai Khan, fewer than 500 managed to straggle back east. The myth of Mongol invincibility, which had held Europe in a grip of fear for decades, was not just broken, it was shattered into a million pieces. The invincible became the hunted. An entire continent had been terrorized, and in response, it had learned a terrible lesson from its tormentors. Europe learned the Mongols' own truth. To survive monsters, you must become one yourself. For centuries, the story was dismissed by many as a dark fairy tale, a nationalistic myth. But modern archaeology has begun to unearth the chilling evidence. Mass graves have been found in the Carpathians, the bones bearing the unmistakable marks of butcher knives, evidence of desperate cannibalism. Polish archaeological sites from the period have revealed caches of weapons, tools not for farming, but forged specifically for killing Mongol horsemen. And yes, the foundations of old churches have been discovered, mixed with an unnaturally high concentration of bone fragments. The whispers were true. The terror of this counter-invasion echoed for generations among the Mongol peoples. For centuries, they spoke of Poland not as a land of conquest, but as a cursed place, a nightmare realm they called the Land of Death. It became a warning, a tale told to frighten children and caution ambitious Khans. Perhaps the most poignant epitaph comes from one of the last known survivors, a warrior named Kutuz, whose testimony was recorded by a Persian chronicler. Reflecting on the campaign and its horrific end, he left a chilling warning, not for his enemies, but for his own people. He said, "We were not gods. We only taught the sheep to become wolves." Thank you for joining us on this dark journey through history. What do you think? Was this a justified response to invasion or a descent into the same darkness the Poles sought to destroy? Let us know in the comments. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the forgotten corners of the past. Until next time, stay curious.